morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, SOC2 Guide for MSPs, presented by Rea Associates, a top 100 regional CPA and business consulting firm with offices across Ohio. My name is Imani Fields, and I'll be moderating today's presentation. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items to cover. First, if you have any questions during today's presentation, you may enter them into the chat box on your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as we can at the conclusion of today's presentation. However, to be respectful of your time, we know that we will not be able to get to them all. Therefore, following today's webinar, we will review all questions and send out the answers via email as soon as we can. Also, if you'd like a copy of today's slides, you'll find that they're available in the handout section of the webinar dashboard on your computer screen. Today's webinar will be given by Garland and Paul Hugenberg. Brian is responsible for conducting IT risk assessments and control reviews for clients across the firm's multi-office footprint. Ambitious, resourceful, and determined to provide the highest quality service and advice to clients. Brian specializes in cybersecurity, IT control best practices, and disaster recovery services. A principal and director of cybersecurity services, Paul Hugenberg educates clients about the current threats and risk mitigation opportunities in the cyberspace, ensuring compliance and reliance on those controls where needed. With more than 20 years of experience, his areas of expertise include impact of cyber incidents on business survival, compliance processes, current industry risk and use cases, and more. And I will pass it on to you guys.
Great, thanks, Imani. I appreciate the introduction. So this is Brian Garland again from Rea Associates, here with Paul Hugenberg, just to walk through some guidance for the folks on the webinar today related to SOC 2. So there's quite a few items that we want to get through today to hopefully to bring some clarity to everyone who's on the call in terms of what SOC 2 is, what it isn't, and what you should be thinking about as your MSP or organization is looking at the SOC 2 framework to get you to your goals and strategic aspirations. So with that, just want to thank everyone who's joined. Looking forward to walking through this topic with everyone. So to kind of kick things off, want to get kind of an agenda out to everybody. So again, we're talking through the AICPA SOC 2 framework today. Really wanted to kick things off with just some common myths regarding SOC 2. Depending on what resources that you look at, there's just certain things that either don't align with the guidance or the framework that's out there that's kind of being spread as a myth under the framework. So we just want to hit on a couple of those and try to debunk them at the start to level set where we're at, for everybody on the call. And then we're going to cover just SOC structure. What flows into a SOC 2 and what doesn't, and which areas can be kind of added on if you're looking for a SOC 2 structure, but maybe you have HIPAA related controls or considerations or requirements from your clients or PCI. So we're going to talk through some situations like that. What is a SOC 2 designed to do for your MSP to kind of get you to your next level. Walk through a few reasons to leverage the SOC 2 framework. And then maybe even identify a few situations where SOC 2 might not be the best option for your organization, depending on what you're doing and where you're trying to get to. So just to talk through some other options where those may be more preferable. So one of the things to kind of kick things off, we want to kind of launch a poll question for the group just to get a sense of the individuals that are on the call. So in terms of the poll, which of the following for your MSP is your kind of primary approach to satisfying customer prospect due diligence requests? So think of individuals such as myself on our side of the fence, where we're auditors requesting documentation on a client's behalf from an MSP. Do you typically, have you already gone through a SOC 2 process and this is a refresher, or do you leverage work that you've done with NIST, HITRUST, the ISO framework, or others?
The results are in.
Forgive me here, I'm having a challenge seeing the results.
So it looks like SOC
Go ahead,
is
Imani.
at 15%. I'm going to say NIST. I'm not a cyber person, so I hope I'm saying that right. 17%. High trust, maybe 17%. ISO, 0%, and other is 50%.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think that's probably fairly consistent. I don't know if you would agree, Paul. I mean, I think that's in line with kind of what we would expect, what we kind of see out in the market. Anything to, I guess, add to that, Paul?
No, I'd agree. That's pretty consistent. So there's a lot of what I'll say are ad hoc or best practices that folks perform inside that they use to support these best practices or due diligence requests. We are seeing more people move to a structured, framework-oriented, such as a SOC2 approach inside, which is kind of the purpose for making sure that we had this call today. Most of that, I think, is because regulations are getting tighter, more industries are getting more aware. The larger type of frameworks that have been around for a while are starting to get pushed down into the small, medium-sized business market as well. And so I'm not surprised that we see some of the others there. But yes, it's consistent, Brian.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so like I mentioned in the agenda piece, just a few kind of common myths that we want to walk through surrounding SOC2. So Paul, yeah, I can read these off and just for each one kind of give your take on it. So anyone can perform a SOC for me.
So this is great. So in a lot of conversations that we get into from time to time, folks talk about getting a review done, referencing the word SOC, both on a SOC 1 and a SOC 2, and having somebody down the street perform that for them or a friend perform that for them. One of the things that's really important to understand is frameworks generally have let's just say they have an acceptance rate within particular industries and geographies, and they also have a requirement in most instances for particular people to do the review. So within the SOC requirements, this is really a specific framework, well adopted in North America, highly regarded in terms of proof for due diligence that comes from the AICPA. So the short answer here is this has to be done by a CPA. The opinion has to be signed by a CPA. So while the criteria, Brian, I think that you're going to go through here a little bit later is publicly available and people can look at it and certainly leverage it for best practices, the SOC cannot be performed by anyone. It has to be performed by a CPA firm.
Great, yeah, that's a great point. So myth number 2, I can get a SOC2 certification, in quotes.
So I love this. So again, in some of those conversations, we hear a lot of questions. Who here is SOC certified? Who here is SOC 2 certified? I am SOC 2 certified. To be clear, certification does not align with the SOC 2 framework. So the SOC reports, these service organization reports, are framework-based evidence of controls and governance to meet the framework that result in an opinion by the CPA firm regarding the suitability of those controls to meet the objectives of the SOC 2. So the scope is going to be X. You have controls in place. Are those controls suitable to get you to X? And then a CPA signs the opinion. So when we use the certification word, that's misplaced with SOC. There are no SOC 2 certifications.
Yeah, and if I can just kind of, I guess, piggyback on that, I mean, one of the main components of the SOC 2 is that or just the SOC framework in general, is that it's a rolling period. So it's not okay, once we get through a SOC 2 Type 2 done, we can broadcast it to the world, and now we can say that we're SOC 2, certified, or that we had a clean opinion under SOC 2. It's a rolling rolling period where becomes kind of an ongoing compliance aspect as part of your organization. Okay, myth number 3, it's a technical examination only.
So in this one, Brian, I know this is one that you and I talked about, so you're going to have some insight on this one as well, but think again or I guess just keep in mind again where the SOC is coming from the EICPA. This is a accounting framework. It's meant to not only understand controls in the technical aspect of the world, in the accounting aspect of the world, but it's really coming from an organization that's assisting businesses and how businesses operate and how users of information from that business can rely upon it. I mean, that is really, at the end of the day, what an accounting firm is attempting to do: fairness, accuracy, representation, completeness, things like that. The SOC is meant to be usable by organizations to understand how systems impact, in the SOC 1, the financial world, and the SOC 2, the system world. And they go beyond just the technical aspects of the in-scope systems. They are policy and procedure driven. They are management and implementation driven. They are culture top-down driven. So there are steps that folks can take on their own to determine if they are technically complete, technically sound. The SOC 2 is going to go a little bit beyond that again because there's a business orientation to this. Brian, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And I don't want to kind of restate what you said, but to put it under a different lens. I mean, I think this is where, MSPs or all organizations that we're working with under the SOC 2 framework, it tends to be as significant or, maybe even more challenging of a step to get what we would term like the governance layer aspect of what goes into a SOC. So making sure that those policies and procedures are set, that we have, clear top-down, communication of values within, the organization, and even to pick on like the risk assessment component, which is a large component within SOC 2. So just wanted to make sure that it was clear that, this is not only a technically driven review, that it definitely branches out from that business-wide. So let's see, myth number 4. So all SOC 2s are the same, all vendors are the same.
Yes, this is great. So you'll get more into the structure of the SOC 2 here in the next couple of slides, so I won't belabor this point. But the SOC 2 framework has things that are required, it has things that are optional. So you're taking a look at a SOC 2, it's very important for you to read the scope section of the SOC 2 in order to understand what it is that opinion is trying to communicate to you. And you, as a person who's trying to have a SOC 2 performed on you, select a firm to do it and scope it out. Make sure that you have a conversation. We don't need to do more than is necessary. We can walk through the required components based on your particular industry and industry needs. So all vendors that perform this are operating under the same rules, and those rules are optional for most services. So make sure you have that conversation.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Paul. All right, so the next myth, a SOC has no ROI for the MSP, MSSP. I'll jump in on this one, Paul. So, from this standpoint, again, as MSPs, MSSPs are looking at the SOC 2 framework, typically it's a discussion around, a strategic discussion in terms of maybe there's a certain industry, certain client or set of clients, client base that the MSP, MSSP is looking to target. Think of, our more regulated industries, financial services, healthcare, things such as that, where a SOC 2 is kind of a standard due diligence request from that type of client. And so it has to be seen more as I think a competitive advantage or a barrier to entry into certain client bases or certain markets. So it's just want to kind of talk through that, we shouldn't be looking at the SOC 2 as just this check the box ongoing, compliance requirement that has no ROI attached to it. you know, if that's the case, then I think, you know, it just needs to be clear in terms of the markets that you're trying to get into and where it positions you as an MSP and an MSSP. Okay, moving to the next myth. So all opinions are equal.
Yeah, so this is an important one, right? This is going to get more into the fundamental purpose of the SOC 2, and again, Brian will touch on this a little bit. But so we have clean opinions, we have or unqualified opinions, and then we have qualified opinions. So when you're reading the opinion on our SOC 2, what is really important to understand or to read through is, did the auditor state that this is an unqualified opinion, which means that you can rely upon the controls, the deficiencies, if there are any, are not significant enough to cause major concern? Or is the opinion qualified, which means that there are deficiencies in the control structure and the reader should be aware of those when relying upon the report? This is often a reason why people do a prep review for SOC before they go into the opinion report, because nobody wants a qualified opinion. That's not a report that you would send out. So opinions are different. The other item to take into consideration here, and we use a lot of SOC references as we talk, but SOCs obviously come in two types, the type 1 and or SOC 1 and SOC 2, to distinguish between financial objectives and system objectives, but they also come in two types, type 1 and type 2. The type 1 is a review of a point in time, so are your controls adequate and suitable to meet the objectives as of the time of the audit. So it's a point in time, it's not reliable after, it's not reliable before, it's at the point in time where we sign the opinion. And then the type 2 is the dual opinion, where you get the suitability opinion, but you also get a review over a period of time, so say a year. So when you're looking at the reports, make sure you spend some time and read the opinion. They're all written pretty much the same way. They follow a format, but they're going to expressly communicate to you whether or not they are qualified or unqualified, and whether or not they are point in time or whether or not they are over a period of time for effectiveness. Thanks, Brian.
Oh, great. Okay, moving to the next myth. So a SOC 2 satisfies other regulations.
So this is great. So if you go through a SOC 2 and you say, look, I'm a HIPAA shop. If I do the SOC 2, does it satisfy HIPAA? If I do a SOC 2, does it satisfy ISO? There's a question that came in about ISO that we'll handle here in a minute. I'm SOC 2, does it handle PCI for credit cards? You know, just state the above. I'm a SOC 2 client and I have an information systems risk assessment. You know, is it going to cover both of those requirements? So a SOC 2 satisfies a number of other regulations in terms of mapping and overlap. So the important discussion, again, not only what's included in the scope, but when you're sitting with the provider to perform the review, or you're relying upon somebody else to give you their SOC 2 and then using it to compare against what you're looking for, there are several places that you can find publicly available mappings into the other regulations. Here at Rea, we can obviously communicate that to you with, with our own information, but there are certain circumstances where the SOC 2 itself will cover what it is that you expect to be covered in other regulations, and where there are gaps, those gaps are going to be limited, so they can be added to the scope. So SOC 2 by default is not going to satisfy HIPAA, but SOC 2 plus items in HIPAA that are not in the framework and are added to the review, then can conclude with a report that does satisfy both.
No, and I think that's a great kind of bullet point to walk through, Paul, so appreciate that. And then just to kind of wrap up this slide, a SOC 2 cannot include other regulations.
Yeah, so this is really just a follow-on to the last bullet, but you can perform SOC exam, so a SOC 2 exam, and reference it as a SOC 2 plus, and after the plus would be the other regulations that you want to make sure the reader knows were covered. SOC 2 plus HIPAA, SOC 2 plus ISO, SOC 2 plus high trust. Those types of additions are allowed by the standard, and they are used quite often. So if you're an organization that is doing business with a bunch of dental offices and you're handling business associates agreements and often doing HIPAA reviews or are held to HIPAA standards, and you ask for a SOC2 to be done, you really want a SOC2 plus HIPAA, right? Do the one report, make sure that it adds the components that are not in the framework by itself, limits the additional expense necessary to meet the standard, and then you have one document that can be shared with your clients, SOC2 plus. Brian, before we move on, we've had 2 questions come in while we were going that. So if that's okay, I'm going to go through these really quick, and I think it'll set the stage for what's coming next. First question here was, will a SOC2 audit or certification prepare me for an ISO certification? So again, we won't use the word certification when we're referencing SOC2. We're going to talk about an audit and an opinion. SOC2 and ISO, so ISO 27001 is an international standard that covers system scope and has a framework associated that's publicly available. Again, like SOC, there are certain people that need to perform that review. In a SOC, it needs to be a CPA. In an ISO, it needs to be somebody certified to perform that review. A lot of times your CPA will hold both. They are so closely related that the path that you would take for SOC2 to ISO is to perform the SOC2 report first and then go after ISO. And the reason why is because the control structure around governance between the two are almost a layover. ISO requires, in addition, some evidence about an ongoing information system management program. It's an ISMS, if I recall correctly. And that ISMS difference are a few items that the SOC does not require but could be added afterwards. Now, again, you can do a SOC2 plus ISO if you like, and just add those control frameworks into the review and get it done with one report. So suggestion is start with SOC2 and then move over to ISO if that is your preference. Within the United States, SOC2 is well more prevalent and received than ISO, unless you're in government space, and then ISO obviously is received quite nicely. Second question is, can I say that I've had a SOC2 audit completed? Is it true if I've had that done to be able to use those words instead of certification? Absolutely. So you can have a report or a letter that's actually written that is available for you to communicate to your customers that you're in the process of getting a SOC2 done. Won't state an opinion, won't state how the audit's going, won't state if it's going to be good or bad, but it can communicate to your customers that you are going through that review. Once that audit is done, that SOC2 report, as Brian will go over here in a minute, is a private report, so it can't just be shared publicly. But you are more than welcome to communicate to prospects and clients that you have had a SOC2 done and it is completed. And if they sign the appropriate NDA with you, then you can share that. So I hope that answers those 2 questions about ISO, as well as using the audit versus certification term for your SOC reports. Third question came in, SOC2 plus CMMC, is that available? I don't know yet. To be honest, I am not sure of that. CMMC is let's just say that it is a horizon that is getting clearer every day, but there still is a lot of conversation related to its impact as it's rolled out through the Department of Defense supply chain. It is such a heavy regulation that there's a lot of conversation about how far it gets pushed down and what the weight is that even smaller organizations have to bear, and then whether or not AICPA will allow us to add the CMMC components to SOC. My opinion, just off the cuff, is probably not going to be a good fit. CMMC is pretty intense. And there is a lot of work to do in a CMMC. I would almost suggest that those who are CMMC compliant will have a much easier time going through a SOC audit than going the other way around. So more to come on that, and we'll certainly communicate that to folks as we hear more on CMMC. Brian?
Great, thank you, Paul. Appreciate it. Okay, so as we move forward, so we just wanted to spend a little bit of time calling out a few of the aspects related to the SOC2 framework, just for those on the webinar today, just to make it clear what we're actually talking about within this framework. So again, the Service Organization Control, or SOC report, is a framework from the AICPA, and it's built upon the trust services criteria, which previously, if you were to Google or research on your own, just to make sure that it previously was referred to as the trust services principles and criteria. So they've amended that, and so the same framework is now the trust services criteria with the latest amendment. And so as we're looking at the SOC2 framework, as we've talked about already, there's there may be for your organization a desire to include other regulatory add-on controls, such as HIPAA, to your framework. But within the actual SOC2 framework itself, there are 5 different kind of categories of controls or domains. So that's what we have listed here in terms of security, privacy, availability, processing integrity, and confidentiality. And so you'll notice here that security is highlighted in red and the only one that we've marked as required. So this is what is referred under the framework as the common criteria. So the base set of controls, I believe 33 controls or control objectives that are part of every single SOC2 engagement. The others, and why they're reflected as optional, are really dependent upon your situation as an MSP, MSSP, and the services that you're trying to provide to your clients and cover under the SOC. So a good example, to me for that would be if you're an MSP that offers, has a data center and also offers, hosting services where availability concerns or availability controls might be important to your client base. Well, then there's a subset of a handful of controls under availability that could be added as another component within the SOC2. Again, optional, not required, but for certain arenas, like a data center, if you will, it's really kind of required as part of what your clients are looking at. Similarly, you could use the same logic against the other ones as well. Privacy, if you're containing information or holding information that is private in nature, there's a whole subset of controls that would fall under that could be added to the SOC2. But again, to reiterate, security or the common criteria control set is the only one that is required as a basic part of the framework. So I believe we touched a little bit on this, but just to make it clear, so under the AICPA framework, there are SOC1, SOC2, and SOC3 reports. And so today's discussion is about SOC2, and as we've talked about, covers things regarding security, availability, confidentiality, the middle box here on this slide. But there also is a SOC1 and a SOC3. So a SOC1, just for clarity for everyone, is focused on internal controls over financial reporting. So typically this is aimed at organizations, I've used like examples as payroll processors or, other processors, think of like medical billing companies that are receiving data from their clients, whether payroll or medical information, processing it in a financial aspect, and then reporting on it back to their clients. And so a SOC1 is a standard report for that organization. Think of like an ADP or a Paychex to have one auditor come in, review the control set, and then be able to provide that to all the clients that rely on the controls of that third-party processor. And then moving to SOC3. So SOC3 is similar to the SOC2 framework, but not as common, I would say, compared to the first two. It's a higher level report. It's for public distribution. And so obviously comparing SOC3 versus SOC2, there's a lot less information in terms of the controls that are included in it. But it does have its purpose for certain clients. And again, to call out, the SOC1, the SOC2 are restricted in scope or private. So these are not publicly available documents, and SOC3 fits that public need.
Brian, so this is really important for folks that are looking to do some of the things that maybe align with an MSP's desire to undergo best practice reviews, but really want to be able to communicate that out to clients and let them know what they're doing and maybe even brand the moment. So, we mentioned ISO before. ISO has a stamp that you can put on your website once you pass certification. High Trust has an organization that will help you do that as well. SOC will allow you to do that, but only through the SOC 3. So if you can envision on your website, you want to say we are SOC 3 compliant and put that stamp on your website, you can, but you cannot do that with SOC 2 or SOC 1. So again, this is part of the discussion that you want to have before you enter into an arrangement to have a SOC done is what's the objective? You're doing this because you're losing business? You're doing this because you're entering into an industry that requires it? Are you doing it because it's best practice and you want to be ahead of the curve? Or are you looking to brand it? And that discussion is going to drive which of the SOC products that you want. Brian?
No, that's perfect. Thank you, Paul. All right, so
Brian, let me jump in one more time, and I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but just to go back to that last slide, what happens if you do a SOC2 Type 2 and you do send it out to somebody? So while it's private, you do decide, hey, I'm going to send this out to someone, I'm going to let them read it. The CPA firm will not stand behind the SOC2 report if it is shared with parties that it is not intended to. So this is really where the rubber meets the road on how the report is formed, why the opinion is written, who the opinion is written for in order to read, and then why we labeled it as private. So obviously, we're going to tell you that you can't share it, and it becomes, kind of an ethical issue if you do. But we will only stand behind the opinion for its intended recipients. And so that really underscores the private nature of the report. Sorry, Brian.
No worries. Okay, to walk through kind of the timeline, if you will, the organizations that are looking at the SOC 2, typically, if this is the first time going through any type of SOC 2 related assessment, it's typically started with what's termed a readiness assessment. So that's really like a review of the kind of current state of the organization, controls, processes in place compared to that trust service criteria. In other words, referred to as like a gap analysis. This is not an assurance report, meaning that there is not an opinion tied to it. So it's just really to see where you're at, where your gaps are, what remediations you would have to take to get to a level to where you could have a control set that you're comfortable with for your organization to meet the framework under SOC. So that's kind of the first step. So not to just restate what because Paul had started to dig into this earlier, but type 1 is a review of those controls at a point in time. So reviewing kind of the control design and system description at a point in time, not an ongoing test of those controls for a period, just a snapshot, again, at a point in time. And it is a single opinion, so there is an opinion tied to it from the CPA within the report, but it's at a point in time. And then SOC2 Type 2 is the kind of the end goal or the end landing point for all the work that leads up to this. And so this is, you have your system description, you have your list of controls under the framework that you've mapped to meet the control objectives, and these are tested over a period of time. And for those of you that have seen SOC reports in the past, there can be some variability in terms of that period that is covered in the SOC report, but typically it's a 6-month period, and then 6 to 9 month period, and then typically has what's referred to as a gap letter for the period that isn't covered in the SOC in terms of clients saying that controls have not significantly changed since the date of our last SOC reports. You can still rely upon kind of the opinion and the review that was done with our latest SOC 2 Type 2. So just want to make sure that was clear in terms of what each report in Type 1, Type 2 is trying to address and what it communicates to the customers that you're getting it for.
So this is an interesting point to interject that, as Brian mentioned, the gap letter. the SOC reports themselves have a very specific outline and framework. There are required components to the report in order for them to be written and then signed off, or the opinion attached to the report. Gap letter is one that is used when folks go under a due diligence request, and the SOC report was done in the past. How far in the past can we rely upon that work? And can we use a letter written and signed by management, again attesting to those controls in the report and that they have not changed? And then the vendor can rely upon that. Generally speaking, a SOC 2 that is over 1 year old is legacy and outdated and stale. Anything under that, a gap letter can help get you to that 1 year mark. But think about what that gap letter is doing. It's management saying that the controls in place are still there, they haven't changed, and you can rely upon them. Well, that harkens back to the actual SOC 2 review itself, in which there is a section that is a description of systems that is written by management. So if you're an MSP getting a SOC 2, part of it is us bringing the framework and doing the tests. Part of it is you actually writing a description of systems, and then an attestation or a signature by management that the controls described in that description are accurate and true. The SOC 2 is going to perform control tests around systems and descriptions that you attested to. So again, if the SOC 2 itself has inaccuracies in the opinion, in the description of systems, then the opinion is only going to be relevant as far as that description is accurate. And the gap letter is the follow-up by management before the next review is done. Brian.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so just to recap everything that we've talked about, we've covered quite a bit so far. So again, SOC 2 is the trust services criteria, under which common criteria or security is the required control set. Like I mentioned, 33 different control objectives that roll up under the common criteria that are consistent across all SOC 2 reports. And like I mentioned earlier, other criteria are added on based upon your MSP or MSSP's SLAs and customer requirements. And there's a clear distinction between a readiness engagement, a type 1, and a type 2 report. So as we move forward here, wanted to have another poll question for the group. So is your MSP looking to expand into regulated markets, i.e., healthcare, financial services? Yes in the next 1 to 3 years, or no, not at this time.
So it looks like 45% said yes, 9% said yes in the next 1 to 3 years, and 45% said not at this time.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so again, Paul and I talked about this earlier, but again, this all kind of funnels into, for your organization, the strategic discussion in terms of, if we're looking at the SOC framework, what objectives are we trying to meet out of it in terms of, expansion of business into these kind of regulated markets, trying to fit best practice model. And there's a lot of components within that try to drive that decision making in terms of where does your organization need to go, and which attestation documents or certifications are the best route to go. Okay, so to move on here, so really I wanted to talk through again, I feel like we've hit part of it, but kind of the intent of the SOC 2 framework for MSPs or MSSPs. And so I think it goes without saying in terms of, one of the goals from the AICPA in developing this framework is that, the AICPA is helping businesses to demonstrate that they have a commitment, to their internal controls. That's the and aligning the SOC framework with the COSO framework, which is kind of the best practice or one of the best practices out there to review an internal control structure. It's a standardized or recognized way via the AICPA to kind of demonstrate that commitment and attestation to internal control best practices. Another reason here is just, again, depending on the market that you're trying to get into, or even just in general, that SOC 2s are meant to try to bring trust to your organization in terms of what's in the market. I know with the MSPs that we work with, again, with it being a strategic kind of strategic point, that if they consistently run into situations where they're trying to work with prospects, especially larger prospects that are requesting these type of documents, that it can put you on a different level compared to other MSPs in terms of the due diligence that your organization has done, and just to create that trust in terms of the controls and processes that you have. The third one here, I mean, we've hit on this, but it's a requirement. Well, not specifically written, but just kind of what we've seen in terms of a due diligence standard practice or best practice for certain industries. So again, I keep mentioning, financial services or healthcare, industries where we have regulated data, especially, in the event that your MSP or MSSP is providing certain services. Think of in a HIPAA environment if you're hosting, certain EPHI. So there's just more scrutiny in terms of, and rightly so, but more scrutiny in terms of what controls that you have for that, as those organizations are trying to meet the compliance and regulatory requirements that they have for, data security, under like the HIPAA security rule. Then the last bullet point here is just, obviously creates, in our view, a competitive advantage for an MSP or an MSSP, comparing, working with and bidding against other MSPs in their market or in their space, or even as you're trying to branch out into other new markets, that it helps provide additional backing or additional transparency to what your MSP has. Anything you'd like to add to that, Paul?
I would. So as we're looking at these 4 areas, you can think about how the lens of an MSP as it goes to market and continues to push into different industries and prospects, how these make sense, right? We want to be able to communicate to folks who are doing things well. We'd like them to trust us. Certainly, it gives us an advantage over organizations that have not invested the time and effort to handle their networks in a controlled and governed fashion. But I want to focus on the requirement for certain industries. So think about why Fedramp exists, or CMMC exists, or High Trust exists. Certain organizations have requirements themselves to maintain controls over their information systems, and most often that is driven by the type of data that those systems are accessing or storing. So that organization has to understand where it's sharing its information, who's holding it, what vendors it relies upon in order to service the governance structure over that data. And the only way for them to do that is to reach out to your MSP and say, hey, I'm under an audit and I need to know your inventory. I need to know what type of data you're storing where. I need to know where my data is. I need to know where it's backed up. I need to know who accesses it. I need to know the type of people that you hire. I need to know how you review logs and make sure that my data hasn't been accessed inappropriately or lost. I need to know how you review threats to my data. And you can imagine, if you're an organization that has 50 customers, and those 50 customers are all calling you and asking those same questions, think of the effort, right? And the inefficiencies and just the frustration and headaches that brings. So these regulations and up to SOC are meant to provide you kind of a one-touch experience that allows you to help your clients meet their regulatory requirements without you being burdened by multiple requests for the same information. So remember, the goal here of the SOC 2, although there are some demonstration components, trust components, advantage components for you, the purpose of the SOC 2 is because your client has a requirement to understand what you do. And so if you're walking into these industries, this is going to be the standard that you're going to begin to have to meet, and it's going to be the language that you get in your request. We'd like to see your third-party service auditor report. We'd like to see your SOC2 Type 2. Very few people are going to say, can we schedule a time to come audit you? And very few MSPs are going to be willing to let their clients do that. So again, if you're getting into these industries, this is a cost of entry. Brian?
Great, thank you, Paul. So why SOC2? And I feel like we've hit on a couple of these, and I would say this, isn't an exhaustive list, but SOC2, from our standpoint, again, this is a recognized, industry-wide recognized framework under the AICPA. In a certain aspect, how it differentiates itself from other security frameworks or frameworks that are out there, that it is opinion-based reporting on internal controls. Again, we've walked through that idea or the timeline in terms of how you have to walk through a readiness assessment all the way to get to a SOC2, and then it becomes a rolling, kind of an annual compliance opinion-based requirement. So compare that to something like maybe your shop relies on the NIST framework or NIST cybersecurity framework as kind of your key basis for mapping out your internal controls. Well, that's great, and we utilize that within our practice as well. But the difference, I guess, with the SOC2 framework is kind of that third-party attestation element to it, to get just that opinion-based review. And then the third bullet point, and again, this is definitely an item that we obviously see being on this side of the fence, that we're working with clients and trying to work through audits and reviews that include talking with MSPs, but it serves as a primary documentation request by risk management teams. So just, as they're doing their vendor due diligence, just it's an easy document that they can leverage to see the controls there. So okay, key questions to address here. So just to give you kind of a couple things, and I won't read through each one of these, but as you're thinking through the SOC2, what type of requests are you consistently getting from your customer suppliers about IT controls, data security? How much time do you spend on the month, quarter, year marketing? Again, kind of jumping back to the comment of Paul saying that, just think of the kind of demands on your employees' time responding to requests. And then how do other companies in your market promote, position themselves related to cybersecurity? So just trying to, benchmark yourself in terms of the SOC compared to your competitors, and to see if this is becoming a hindrance in terms of where your MSP is trying to get. Okay, so like we had mentioned at the beginning, there are other options for MSPs, and we walked through some of this here in terms of, as we had the discussion about, ISO and how it relates to SOC and CMMC and all that. So there are other options. Again, I know I just talked about the NIST framework. NIST can serve a purpose for certain MSPs, depending upon what you're trying to get at, as far as providing information to clients. Obviously, it was ISO, high trust, and then other industry-specific frameworks, depending on where your target market and your customers are at. Those are part of the drivers there. But there are other options that are available outside of the SOC framework. And I do have a couple, I guess this is one of the last slides that we have here. So I just wanted to kind of call out, this is not an exhaustive review or what have you for MSP market trends, but just as we were seeing, just certain things, in the MSP space, kind of on the horizon, and trying to relate this to our discussion today around SOC2s. And so, in a little bit of the research that I did for this, the global managed services market has an expected growth rate over the next, from 2020 to 2026 at an expected growth rate of about 11%. If you do the math on that, I think that, the market of itself didn't exactly double, but it wasn't too shy from that. And so, what is kind of the downstream effects of that? Most most of the research that I was able to review said, in this market, which is with the expansion of business, that mergers and acquisition activity expected to increase. There's more of a migration to cloud platforms. Customers may be more focused on cybersecurity initiatives. So in terms of SOC 2, how I was looking at this through the lens of that is that, again, SOC 2 helps an MSP and MSSP be a differentiator in terms of the markets that they're trying to get to. And again, with expansion of the overall market, there's a lot of opportunities for business, but then there's going to be a lot of players that'll be involved in terms of so it'll be a clear need to help differentiate your MSP versus others that are within the same service. So I know I covered that kind of quickly. I think we have a couple questions that we want to walk through before we wrap up. So Paul, if you're able to read those off for us.
I am, and we have about 10 minutes to attendees, so please drop your questions in so we can get through as many of these as we can. First question that we have is, how about SOC 2 plus Fedramp? So let's spend just a moment talking about what the SOC 2 plus is. So SOC 2 obviously is based off of those common criteria that Brian had talked about, and the plus allows the testing matrix to include things that are involved in other frameworks or regulations that do not map back to the SOC 2 framework. So yes, you can do a SOC 2 plus Fedramp. You can do a SOC 2 plus HITRUST, SOC 2 plus HIPAA, SOC 2 plus PCI. The guidance allows that to occur. Here's where the rubber meets the road. You're performing a SOC 2 in almost all situations for one of two things. Either you want to be able to communicate that you've taken best practice steps, set yourself apart from your competitors, or you're responding to due diligence requests to a particular customer or industry that's going to rely upon that report. So the question really becomes, have you discussed with your potential industry prospect what they will accept? So this is really more than just a simple question. It really is kind of the basis between how clients and prospects of Rea, when we're talking to them about SOC 2 opportunities, what we want to know before we just say, yes, we'll do it. There are plenty of vendors who simply send out emails and say, hey, we do a SOC 2, we do it cheap, we do it quick, you need one, use us. And that has just so many areas fraught for problems that what we try to do is sit down and have a meeting with you about what you're trying to accomplish. Brian mentioned and had a slide about a couple of other options for MSPs that are available. You really want to investigate that. Money is important. You don't have an endless bucket of cash to spend on expenses. A lot of us are managing profit and ROI and efficiencies. We're going after particular markets. There's a high likelihood you could talk to us and we say a SOC 2 is not where you want to be. Based on your customer, you need to do ISO. You're heavily government, maybe ISO is where you want to go. Hey, you're going into DoD. Well, we just need to move and do a CMMC review because that's going to be the most benefit for you. So yes, you can do SOC 2 plus Fedramp. The report gets longer. We add a bunch of things that Fedramp expects that SOC 2 does not include. But again, as will your client receive that report for what its objective is supposed to be? Will they accept it? Brian, do you have input to that as well?
Yeah, the piece that I would add to that is just, again, part of having that initial discussion is, making sure that it's clear, even with that discussion with the client or the client base that you're trying to target, in terms of, we need to definitely clearly understand the scope of what is needed. Again, the common criteria is the basis. You can add the other components to the SOC or do a SOC plus. But we've seen situations where maybe even from the client standpoint that they're not exactly comfortable with what all is included in the framework and how you can make decisions to scope certain things out that aren't applicable. And so we'll see, well, we want we want to cover everything. You know, the client will say, well, we want to cover everything, or we expect to see everything in the SOC report. So there can be some discussions there that really help try to facilitate getting down to what the real requirement is there to limit kind of the scope and the amount of work that it takes to get the SOC 2 in place.
Right, and Brian, you can even think about situations, you and I have seen these where, you know, a client says, hey, I need a SOC 2, and we start to talk to them, and what we find is they're really an organization that is performing maybe the storage and transmission and processing of data that leads its way to the financial statements. And what they're really trying to get to is a SOC 1, right? It's this, the scope, the client that needs it, the purpose they need it, what it's going to be used for, it really drives the service. And just because you run a network doesn't mean that SOC 2 is what you want, and it doesn't mean it's the best thing for you. So again, we spend a lot of time up front making sure that this is what you want and that it fits what you're trying to perform. That actually segues into the next question, which is how much should an MSP expect in terms of cost or effort as they're getting into a SOC 2? So it's a great question, and I'll just be straightforward. A SOC report is going to cost you somewhere in the $15,000 to $30,000 range for the general MSP, depending upon size of your network, clients, and industries that you're in. SOC 2s can get much more expensive than that, but that generally falls in place when you're a very large organization, say like a Symantec. You know, and there's an obvious difference between that type of organization and the traditional community MSP or MSSP. So you should be budgeting somewhere in that $15,000 to $30,000 range. We generally see it in the low 20s. There is a prep component of the SOC process that Brian had mentioned, which is in itself a separate engagement. So you can envision a SOC report being a little bit less than that range I just gave you when there's been a prep done before. So in total, it's a little bit more expensive because you have two projects. You have a prep and then you have the SOC report itself, but you're ready to go. That SOC event's going to be pretty clean and efficient. But that's the range that you need to start considering and set aside. Now, Brian and I are very aware of companies that kind of send out messages and say, hey, we can do a SOC for about $4,000 or $4,500. Good luck. Wish you the best if you go that route. The report itself is time consuming, it is important, it is comprehensive, and it is useful for your audience. So I hope that answers that question with some clarity for your budgeting purposes. There's another question here. Brian, maybe you can address this. What's the difference between a qualified and unqualified opinion?
Yeah, no, so that's perfect. So an unqualified, or you'll see the term unmodified opinion, is not to keep throwing different terminology out of the AICPA to you, but that would be a clean opinion. And so even if you know, us as service auditors come in and review the controls under the SOC report, even if there are, say, exceptions identified, we're able to understand those exceptions, and they're limited in the scope in terms of their impact for the overall kind of the objective of what the SOC is trying to get to, like a limited impact to the overall system description. And so, you know, obviously the unmodified is the goal. If there's a modification, that you know, it can be clearly written in terms of what that modified opinion relates to. So it, you know, typically reads, you know, we agree, you know, with the controls and the system description as it's been presented, except for X, you know, except for this specific requirement or specific subset of controls where there were issues identified. Again, I believe Paul had mentioned this, you know, with the way that this document, a SOC 2 audit, is utilized, you know, you want to be sure, especially if it's your first time going through it, that's why a lot of companies rely on the prep engagement, is that, you know, a qualified report is not what you really want to be distributing out to prospects and the clients that are requesting it from their standpoint. So we want to make sure to try to, you know, for the period that you're ending on, that we can get to that unmodified opinion. But hopefully that helps bring clarity there. Okay, are there any other questions that you see, Paul? Or are we kind of in line to wrap things up here?
I think we've answered everything I've seen come through. Any other questions in the question pane?
No, that would be it. All right,
Well,
guys.
great.
Well, go ahead.
No, I think I was going to say the same thing as you. So go ahead.
Awesome. So thank you guys for joining us for today's webinar, SOC2 Guide for MSPs. We hope the team was able to provide you with some valuable insight in regards to best practices and potential solutions. If you sign off today and realize you have additional questions, you're always welcome to reach out to Brian and Paul directly. And thank you, and we hope you have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.